ejecutiva de la Oficina para América Latina del IP UNESCO y les iré presentando.
I will talk to you about the different possibilities. To start interpretation, please click on the world map and you choose the language you prefer. Before we start, we invite you to turn on your cameras to get to know each other a little more. And I would also like to ask those who still have not done it to rename your user ID in Zoom, first your name, and then the institution and the country you come from. Also, the help channels, if you have any technical issues, you have the fifth network phone from the office or the mail that you will have now in the WhatsApp, the Zoom chat. This will be available for a while. We will also put a summary that will also be available as of tomorrow. Both the video and the summary will be uploaded to the forum, the link of which is being posted as we speak. Finally, after the presentation of the panelists, there will be a space for Q&A. We ask those of you who want to participate to please tell us the questions in the chat in advance, and according to the time available, we will give you, and we may give you the floor, and you have to turn your mic on then. We are also putting a link for a brief survey to know your opinion about this. We please ask you to provide us some time because it is very important to know your opinion. Yesterday, after the inaugural session, we had the introduction of these two panels. The first one was education, gender inequality, and sexual diversity, and the second one was education and disability. If you could not be there, I wish to remind you that you can be on the video and on the micro side of this event. So now we will move to panel number 3 of the forum: education, socioeconomic status, and geographic economic. I will give the floor to Henry Armas, who is the coordinator for the technical mm, office of the IIEP Latin America. Henry, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Mercedes. Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome all of you to this third map of the investment, the socioeconomic status and geographical location. Everybody this year, this seminar is the fourth of the GEM report for the follow-up in 109 countries for in the agenda for sustainable development. The OS4, which is the commitment of the general uh, society and to provide learning opportunities, provides a special place for all ideas, and it is one of the possibilities in our commitment not to leave anybody behind. As a function of the resources, equity and inclusion have become the central promises of the Agenda 2030. Among the characteristics that come with inequality, we find gender, richness, disability, language, migration, displacement, the people in prison, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, and other beliefs. Some of the mechanisms that make it worse are universal, whereas others are valid for certain social and economic contexts. The educational systems are not a vacuum. They are molded by the social, cultural, economic, and political realities where they live. That is why they reflect the historical elements of inequality and discrimination with the risk of reproducing them. The educational systems depend on the societies where they exist. So, whereas the unequal societies may create fair and unfair systems, those who are inclusive may contribute to create societies that are more fair and inclusive. Those of Latin Americans and the Caribbean have gone a long path to try and remedy the situations of the past, but they are marked by some divides. Some of our taken a big equality, a lot remains to be done. And although we have seen some progress in the reduction of poverty and inequality, the perhaps that the education does not exist in a vacuum. In this nation have an income as a result of education was 5 times more we would have to send to other school. Only 18%, 11.7 thousand to 3.4% since 2000, those with disability. The inhabitants of the rural areas represent 18% of the population of the region, but 41% of those who are in extreme poverty. The situation of education in Latin America and Caribbean reflects both the history and the new developments. Presence in schools and finalization of schools have improved over the past 20 years. When poverty coincides with other vulnerability, the disadvantages in education become larger. For example, in 7 countries, both boys and girls of the poorest rural areas have they have less than 50% finalized junior high school. Rural areas have 30% of all of the educational of the schools of the in Chile. The Chilean decree 968 focused on the rural schools. In Peru, there was a national network of the girls. In 2001, we have the special emphasis was on rural areas. Many kids work in rural areas and they have big challenges. The alternative focus can assist in guaranteeing the right to education. Elements as radio and, and television have allowed to allow to the kids who live in rural areas, but it has been very difficult to reach the most marginalized ones. The connectivity problems and make it more difficult to be faced. The flexible education are essential to make it possible to have a good mother. The support of community is vital for the remote rural areas because educating the education in dispersed areas with low density of population is very costly. In the rural areas in the Andes, the communities ask for high school, they prepare meals for schools, and they prepare the schools with collective working like Minda in Ecuador for a single grade. These alternative systems aim at improving the number of people for some of the poorest areas, including those of the rural areas or low income families. The multigrade have the idea to use the resources of the rural areas, but they face also many problems. In Peru, the many of the schools have a single grade classrooms. In Brazil, the census on the indigenous population shows that only 53% of rural indigenous areas and use these materials. In this scenario, although we still have challenges, there are also some progress is being made. Many countries are adopting new systems to solve the problem. In today's panel, we'll see many of these histories regarding the challenges, diagnosis, but also regarding the possibilities as a function of the programs that are being carried out and some recommendations as well. In today's panel, we will have four experts. Two of them are authors of the GEM report, and two of them are regional experts on the issue. I would like now to introduce the first author of the GEM report, Adriana Velasquez. And I would like to say that Adriana graduated in international relations with masters in political sciences, social sciences, public policies, and development. She has worked as an international consultant in these fields in the ECLAC, in the UK, UC, and others. She is a specialist with topics linked to transition, protection, social protection, and reduction of poverty, and globalized improvement of social situation. And many of her the things she has published has been helpful in making a decision. We invite Adriana to please turn her camera on and to share her presentation. Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I will share my screen with you. Please let me know if you can see it. Can you see it?
Ahora sí, Adriana. No en modo presentación, pero
Yes, Adriana.
ahí está, perfecto.
We don't see your presentation. Yes. I want to show you in a nutshell some of the most important findings for the GEM report on social inclusion in the Dominican Republic. I would like to start by talk about the historical progress inducing income inequality in this country. Stemming from the Gini index, we have seen a trend downwards since the year 2000. But in the same behavior that we see, this indicates in Latin America, these this has also some caveats when we see the big inequality differences. For example, in 2017, because this study has, this is a historical trend from 2000 to 2017, which is the last year with available information, it's still what 0.431, which means in order to have equality, a perfect equality, we are less than 50%, less than a half. And this the other part, it's an important connection. It also explains why this socioeconomic subject can be seen with the territory, and is that inequality has also differences, geographical differences. In the Dominican Republic, the municipalities group in regions, development regions. For example, you can see on the right-hand side how this difference varies from one region to the next. Some of them are above the national average, while others are way below. And this also tells us how this socio-economic inequality has to do with geography, which forces us not only to have certain information systems to understand what is going on, but also where they are and where the schools are. And this is a very important assumption that we have to know the difference between territories, communities, families, and schools. This being said, from a national perspective, we can see that the country has undergone different periods in reducing poverty after a financial crisis that we had at the beginning of the 2000s. But there's also, because of the demographic transition, in some, and because the young population increases, there's a high exposure of the population from 0 to 24. to monetary poverty. And here, one of the most relevant findings is the high weight of this population within the general population in poverty. For example, in 2017, 60% of people, of poor people, were from 0 to 24 years old, which goes to show the importance of poverty reduction policies in the field of education because there is a barrier for most of the population. Now, there is also, according to the last data available, is how do we see this chart? That is the reduction of inequality, where the exposure of a school population to poverty changes the indicators according to the offer of school or education. And the first thing we see is that the social and economic condition is a barrier for getting access to formal education. Regardless of the age, all of the poor groups have less levels of access than the richest. Never mind what is the pre kindergarten, grade school, high school, junior high school, and so on. All of those where you can see which is the poorest are those who have the highest dropout rates. But it's important to talk about the gap between those who are or the groups that are preschool vis-a-vis high school, and how we see bigger equity in grade school and the first and the junior high school, so to speak. And this obviously goes to show that there is a concentration by age of inequality to the access to education. And as the moderator was saying, we see how the inequality gaps converge to different vulnerability rates for access to education. Now, in this case, it is very important to show that all of the efforts linked to the inclusion of population in schools also goes hand in hand with the effort needed by the population. We see, for example, that in the different ages, more than 40% of the population which is outside school, or that is not going to school, whatever the level, belongs to the lowest economic bracket. And this is very relevant in the case of the Dominican Republic, that has already some kind of social protection system when compared to other countries where there is nothing or very little. We understand that we still have to increase the effort to close the gap between the different socio-economic groups. Another very important thing is the fact that the social and economic distribution also impacts on how people access, how they access in age brackets. For example, right now, the net enrollment rate, we can see that together with a prior, where I talked about the fact that the population is lagging behind, this is also true for these populations. That's where you see the biggest gap between the richest and the poorest in this access to education. And here, this chart, over and beyond the fact that it shows efficacy problems, shows the impact of social and economic gaps in all of the life pattern of people and in the policies linked to the breaking of poverty between generations. Why? Well, grade school or is absolutely of the essence to close the gap of the students for the following levels. The grade school is a very important step to be able later on to close the gap that we have seen in the whole country through a number of tests. But this machinery starts already to show the trend in grade school. And of course, it impacts on even up to university, to all levels. Those who manage to overcome the initial problems have a smaller risk of living in poverty than those who did not. And that's how we can see that this social and economic pattern keeps the educational options of the country to have it as a resources available to be able to leave poverty, not only for them, but all of their relatives later on, the next generations. That's how we see the importance on how to adapt to the access, not the timely access to education in these two elements that are very important to give the education a very important place in its the mobility of society. As I said before, there are also different social and economic gaps according to the tests carried out or service in 2010 and decade shows the the fact that some of the kids are lagging behind vis-a-vis the 20% highest and lowest percent, highest and lowest 20% have a big difference. The poorest have a very unfavorable performance than the richest. Even the national evaluations carried out by the Dominican Republic, shows so much so that performance increases with income level. And of course, this is curtailing the opportunities of the poorest populations, not only for that particular level, but for the next levels and on how to survive in the system later on. This is something that it can open different possibilities in the labor market later. In this chart, we see also issues that happen not only according to formal education, but also the population that is has the age to work. And here the country is already has already a debt with the population which is 15 years and older, for example, in the field of basic things like a reduction of illiteracy. We see that from 2000 and onwards, there has been a sustainable effort to reduce illiteracy in the country, and it has benefit, of course, the 20% of the poorest people. And this is very important when we talk about policies because it has a performance that is not only good for the population, target population, but also for their families, relatives, because they are also lifted up with the education of those who did get an education. Usually, the children have a higher education level than the parents. So the progress made is also linked to the accompaniment in different very poor municipalities. The children are in fifth grade, but parents cannot read or write. So how can they possibly assist their children in getting their homework or anything else that they need to do at home? There's no assistance. That is why it is a very important fact to encourage or foster a greater level of accompaniment of the family to the kids. Here we still have a reduction rate of illiteracy in the Dominican Republic that we have to close. The gap has to be closed, definitely. A lot has been done, but a lot has to be done yet. There's also an increase in the schooling levels of the population, both of the 20% highest and the 20% lowest, but the increase of the schooling levels is also marked by a gap between the richest and poorest, a gap that has not been finished. It's a big divide, and obviously, this is a debt that society has with its population. And that is where we should not only see in functions how you make progress, but also how you work on a more accelerated fashion with the poorest 20% so that they can get faster to the levels of the richest and therefore having a better inclusion from that perspective. There is also another dimension of the impact of inequality that goes hand in hand with privatization of education and how the private schooling coincides with public schools in different alternatives. And here we have a segmentation of the educational sector between private, public, and the semi-official. Semi-official are schools that are managed by NGOs, churches, and others. But here there is a comparison that can be made between those that are 100% private, 100% public, and in the middle. When we see different indicators of dropout rates and others, you can see that there is a very important gap between the private and public schools in favor of the private schools and over and beyond the myth that says that private is better than public. There's also really an impact of social and economic factors. For example, in the Dominican Republic, those in the poorest 20% obviously have more access to public sector and very small access to private schools. In some surveys, see how those of the poorest sector have greater probability of having dropouts, repeating for the because of the reasons of their social and economic condition that goes along with different poverty levels. And in this case, over and beyond the standard performance between private and public, there is a behavioral issue that has to be taken into account that changes from one sector to the next. And right in the middle of this fight between these two sectors, the one in between, the semi official, has a performance quite close to the private schools. So, in the case of the Dominican Republic, all of the semi official schools is very close to the private. This is like a momentum generating school system. In terms of political public, there are progress that has been done, and it depends how the state does its work. But it has to develop a legal framework that joins social protection and the policies, especially those that are oriented to the poverty level. And we have also seen increase in public investment in education, and these have been upheld over time and have been used to develop different actions of public policy oriented to better access and quality of the population with lowest income. In that case, we can talk about the progressive universalization of the extended level to the 2017-18. More than 60% were covered by total enrollment, and we even had food and other elements, uniforms, governments, uniforms, materials, school books.
So we are
So there's a
also
full package.
rehabilitating, revamping the institutions. There is also a diversification of the curricula in high school education, more in favor of inclusion for insertion into the labor market of the poorest, and also an encouragement of the decentralization process so that principals and teachers can provide ad hoc responses to the difficulty presented by low-income population. But there are other challenges, such as public policies. Some of the challenges are the following: to improve, for instance, how public spending increases in education and
social protection and welfare. And education policy, if it is universal, it doesn't distinguish between rich and poor schools. The allocation is the same. But based on the demand, population demand, there are some that have more resources to be able to meet the special needs of their population than others. And here we see that there is a capacity, response capacity bias that should be analyzed, response to the population depending on vulnerability status. And it is necessary to review the relationship that exists between not the relationship, the student-teacher ratio, prioritizing those schools with a high presence of low-income students. It is necessary to raise the level of performance of teachers in the school side with more students from low-income areas. It is necessary to empower the articulation of protection, social protection programs if students have those resources at home. It is very important to enhance school capacity in education institutions to support low-income students that are more exposed to school non-attendance, dropouts, and repeatance rates, and who have a dysfunctional family community environment. The public spending amount should be increased, as I said before, by means of driving more convergence between the different support points and the support provided to families, schools, and poor communities. And non-formal education in poorer populations that are lagging behind educationally speaking should be supported by special social protection programs. This has to do with education, inclusion, future generations. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for allowing me to participate. Thank you, Adriana, for your presentation. I think there are many questions that we can discuss at the end of the four presentations. The following panelist is Mr. Christian Delay. He is a regional expert, our regional expert sociologist from the University of Chile, and he has a PhD from Harvard. And he is the coordinator of education policy from the Universidad Austral in Chile. Christian Belay used to work at the Education Ministry in Chile and UNICEF. He has extensively published on education policy, school segregation, and enhancement of education. His latest books are Understanding Schools and Education in Turbulent Times. 15 minutes, please, Christian, for your presentation. If you can turn on your camera, we give you the 15 minutes, please, Christian. If you thank you, Harry, and I thank the IIEP for inviting me to present in this regional activity that is so interesting about a topic that is so important. And I was invited to participate here. As Adrian already said, this panel is on the most difficult topics to resolve for educational policy in general. So thank you very much. And I thank Adriana for her presentation. She talked about what happens in the Dominican Republic, but her analysis is so good that is overreaching. So the technical, the document, the complete document she produced, I recommend that everybody reads because it gives you an overview, a very clear overview and description of how complex this is. So I will try to build what Adriana has just mentioned, described, trying to draw reflections on education, exclusion, and social class. First, let me tell you something about more along the lines of concepts, and then I will talk about policies and some reflections on the complexity of policies that address social class, socioeconomic status, and inclusive education. Now, directly to the point. Starting point. When we look at the challenge ahead, we have to understand the relationship between opportunities and educational achievements, the social, economic capital of the family the students come from. That's the most solid foundation on which social sciences base education, their education studies. The opportunities and educational achievements to be distributed according to the social, economic, and cultural capital is the earned law of social sciences in education. And this finding is persistent in time, has been generalized, it's widespread among countries. It's not one of a kind. And massification of education to enhance access to school system modify the nature of the problem, but not its existence. We used to talk exclusion in terms of access and permanence in the system. Today we talk about the excluded from the inside, within. The excluded ones are now within, not outside. This is the emphasis I want to make. There is high variation among countries in their capacity to offset the effect of the social origin of students in their school results or outcomes. The way we organize and guarantee the universal right to education on an equal footing makes a difference. And that's the space for politics. So we're fighting a giant. There is a huge field of action to beat the giant. Let us understand the nature of the giant, that is equality relating the social class with educational achievements. We have to understand that this is so complex as a problem that pervades everything to affect the education experience of all students. There are three levels, three aspects that are very relevant for education policies. Multidimensional, right? The relationship between education class and education achievements is not limited to resources or prejudices or policies or pedagogy or discriminatory curriculum or a cultural dimension that must see that lower income students have other types of opportunities. When these dimensions get together, they empower each other, but to the worse. So it's a multidimensional problem, not only a question of resources or bad pedagogy, not at all. This relationship between social classes and social level is also multi-level. Problems and opportunities, I mean, the pros and cons that students bring to school are incorporated in their own education and training, in the cultural distance they have from school, their expectations. Students carry like a backpack with them together. In a classroom, the individual advantages can be empowered. And of course, this creates a wall of opportunities and a wall of risks for discrimination at that level. Teachers do not face only the huge complexity of teaching what one or two students learn, but of organizing a collective dynamic that is productive and favorable for students. And this huge complexity that we see in the classroom was not there when we thought for only one student with special needs. But when we organize in schools, these cultures create certain organizational dynamics that can favor or make more difficult the performance of teachers at school. And now, school systems can also facilitate or make the school job difficult. So this is an unavoidable consequence as we have organized the provision of the right to education. Important to see is for each level, there are new problems at a higher level. But each higher level determines or affects what can be done in lower levels. So there is a double track relationship. The equity policies should not only look at one of these levels, the inequality is multi-level, and there is a question of time. It's cross-cutting. The relationship between social class and education evolves in time. There is a life cycle of people learning lessons that you have, the opportunities you have, and the way you access them will determine the way and the capacity that people have to take advantage of opportunities. This is a common phenomenon to all cultural experiences. You learn on what you have learned before. So, if you've had a good experience, you will have a better experience. That's more likely to happen. This is natural in a cultural sense, and it's typical of all social cultural experiences. Once we organize this as a school performance, well, there are arbitrariness factors that you have to consider. If you look at the factors predicting school achievement, the most important to predict school achievement is the school achievement attained the previous step. So there is a linking of all achievements, and there is an empowering, a driving effect over time. So advantages are inherited many ways, but they always have a way to drag the whole of the education opportunity. So a girl, a boy could have a good experience, good early stimulation, good school, have learned the basics, but then the high school is destructured, doesn't motivate them, and it may lose all its advantages if high school doesn't capitalize the achievements that the student brings from the past. So it has the education opportunity, or it's so difficult to defeat this determination of social class on cultural and educational achievements because it is multidimensional, multi-level, and it is cross-cutting. And it's always at risk, but there is always an opportunity, and there is always a risk. So, let me talk now about education policies in order to move from the concept to the practice. If these are the characteristics of the problem, policies should be focused on addressing the multidimensional and time limitation. As we present in the report, we have to guarantee accessibility in places where there is no transportation, for instance. We had to guarantee certain conditions, the safety of schools. We have to guarantee some resources, teachers that are well trained, the curricula, pedagogy. So the different dimensions appeal or are translated into focuses of policies that we have to take care of. And we cannot address one without addressing the others. And not everything is resolved at one point in time. Yes, preschool education is important, but the emphasis put on them has to be capitalized later in primary school with literacy, acquisition of cognitive skills, intra-social skills, and be supported by high school that will diversify competencies, etc. So we need to have policies that support that life cycle as an education cycle of opportunities. This is quite elementary, but hasn't been supported by policies many times. Now, this seems to be a direct consequence of the understanding of how complex education policy could be. The equity or equitable education policy is better result when it is addressed not as an isolated actor, but in a more comprehensive manner. So we should address policy aspects. The social education programs of a school improvement or enhancement that address school as a unit, multi-dimensional work, resources, reinforcement, pedagogical innovation, education management, school coexistence that is or that favors learning, all those programs should have an education component of equality, of equity, because our intention is to organize learning in schools on an equal footing for all. But not everything is resolved at school. We have already discussed that there are systemic barriers to equality, desegregation by social class, the strengthening of public education, discrimination and selective rationale. All this could attend to the possibility of schools to be equitable. And finally, we had to recognize, although many politicians do not, that teachers are key, are essential. The training of teachers, their working conditions, collective professionalism that we have to create are indispensable for these educational opportunities to be equitable. When a school is well organized and it generates a productive environment, the teachers can meet the needs of students. And when the school systems are segregated and privatization prevails, it's more difficult to put trained teachers at the rich or for low-income students. So we have to go beyond the school. We need to have a community approach. We need to have a social policy in place. And let me talk about this to wrap up, okay? About the tensions and risks of the policy for education equity. I will describe three complexities that are the result of 30 years of research and consolidation of knowledge on policies of equality. Within a context or against a background where not even the basics is achieved, it's very likely that equality policies do not suffice to do what we want to do. So we might end promoting a very targeted pedagogy for poorer students. So we had to assign resources to be equitable, where there is more needs and equality. But we shouldn't fall into the trap of stigmatizing or institutionalizing those that are underprivileged. So we had to be careful. Public education, democratically accessible education, high quality is the solution, but there are different solutions. So we had to be careful regarding focalization versus universal policies. And we have to understand deeply the complexity of socio-educational inequality. We shouldn't be fatalistic. We shouldn't blame victims. Students, families are not interested. No, no, no. It's not naivety. It's a problem that the teachers don't fulfill. No, they are not motivated. Bureaucrats, no, that's not the whole problem to resolve. Or that it is a problem of incentives. We had to gauge how many carrots and sticks to resolve the problem. No, no. The problem of the inheritance of social class and education is much more complex, and I hope we have been able to persuade you along these lines with our two presentations. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Cristian.
Thank you. Now,
Presentación, vamos
after your presentation, we move on to our third panelist, Carolina Rolón Kotovics. She has a degree in social sciences with a master's degree and a PhD in sociology from the University of Porto in France. She has carried out several research work, papers linked to the world of education for organizations such as UNESCO and UNICEF, besides being part of the Institute of Applied Economic Research. Dear Carolina researches the indicators and public policies of the fourth objective, the sustainable development objective. She has also conducted research on transparency and social control of public spending on education and on school inclusion in remote areas of the Amazon. So Carolina will talk during 15 minutes as in her capacity as author, one of the authors of the GEM report. So Carolina, you have the floor.
English, so here I'll try to share. Do you see my presentation? Oh, there. Right. Everything's fine? Yes. So my name is Carolina, and I say good morning or good afternoon from Brasilia to everyone who's watching. And I will present key findings in the challenges to include all children and youth living in rural and remote areas in Brazil. So I'll start with the demographic situation and highlight some SDG 4 indicators that stress the gap between rural and urban areas. From the school inclusion framework in the national level, I will highlight some national legal frameworks in Brazil and the governance and financing system here. And from the other four points from the inclusion framework that I prepared for the GM report, the background paper in Brazil, I will present from the perspective of teachers working in the state in rural and indigenous schools in the state of Amazonas. And that was part of a qualitative research I did with 6 teachers from the region. Yes, so Brazil is a very large country and there are very important regional differences, and that includes the distribution of the population in the territory. So here we have the distribution of children and youth in compulsory schooling age in millions. And in Brazil, the compulsory schooling age is from 4 to 17 years old. So we have there around 17% of those children and youth that live in rural areas nationally. But we see that in the north and they are more concentrated in the north and in the northeast regions. So around more than 1/4 of these students in these regions are in rural areas. But there's also a high amount of children in rural areas in the southeast region. But that's because the population is very large and the southeast region is the most populous region in Brazil, where we have the big cities such as São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Belo Horizonte. So from this, I would just like to stress that the percentage of students in rural areas in Brazil is higher in the north and the northeast regions, which are the poorest regions of the country. Yes, and here just presenting some SDG 4 indicators. I'll start with the first one. That's the percentage of 16-year-olds who have completed lower secondary school. And the second one is the percentage of 19 years old who have completed upper secondary school. And if I didn't put here, but if we look at the primary completion rate, it's around 90% for rural students. So it's 90% in the primary. It goes down to 63% in the lower secondary and 42% in the upper secondary. So there is like a funnel. So we have been able to include the rural students in the primary schools, but we haven't had the opportunity for them to move up in the schooling systems, and the differences are important between rural and urban areas. The second indicator over there that we have is a measurement of the school assessment in math. It's a national school assessment here in Brazil that we call it SAEB, and students in the end of each learning cycle, so in the end of primary, in the end of lower secondary, and in the end of upper secondary, they take a test in math and in reading. And the level, and they are classified in levels that go from 1 to 9 in reading or 1 to 10 in math. And here's the percentage of students who scored level 4 or above, which is considered this level that is adequate for minimum adequate for learning. And we can see that it's very low. Here's for 9th graders. So it's very low for rural students, and it's low also for the urban students, the 9th graders, but still the difference is it's almost 2 times. Yeah, the performance of the urban school students is almost 2 times those of the rural students. And the last indicator here in this table is of the proportion of youth and adults enrolled in tertiary education. Here it's youth and adults aged 18 to 24. So 8% in rural areas and 27% in urban areas. So it also shows that if the youngsters want to move up in the schooling system, they have to leave their communities and go to urban centers. And just these are results I presented with Dr. Milko Maciejczyk, who is my coordinator at IPEA, and there is a paper there about analyzing these SDG 4 indicators in Brazil. The next indicator is also the proportion is about illiteracy in Brazil, the illiteracy level of the adult population, those aged 15 or more. So we have around 17%. So it's still important, significant in the rural areas. So we have 17% of the adults who are illiterate in Brazil. And the second indicator there is those who we call functional illiterates, or people who have less than 4 years of formal schooling. Almost 1/3 of the rural population has less than adult rural population has less than 4 years of formal schooling. So that's still a big problem. And the last SDG 4 indicator that I will present, it's about teacher training. And so in the pre-primary and primary level, here's the percentage of teachers who have a tertiary diploma, higher education diploma. So we have here, again, differences between rural and urban schools are significant. But just stressing that, underlining that in Brazil, teachers from primary and pre-primary, they don't need a tertiary school diploma. They can have a secondary diploma that's called magistério. And with these specific secondary courses, they can teach in primary and in pre-primary schools. And the second indicator there is the percentage of teachers in the lower and upper secondary who have a higher diploma in the subject they teach. So for example, if a teacher has a diploma in mathematics, he teaches math courses. But what we see here is that that's very low. So what happens is that the same teacher, he may teach different subjects. So he was trained, he has the diploma of a math teacher, but there is a lack of teachers in his school. So he will also teach geography, and he will also teach another one, or a teacher who has a diploma in Portuguese, but then she will also teach history or science. So this is an issue, especially in lower secondary schools and in rural areas. And that's the lack of teachers, and shows that also that the same teacher will have to teach subjects that she has no training for it. She has no professional training to teach that subject. Okay, so this is just a general overview of the situation. And it shows the deep gap also between these two rural and urban areas in Brazil. Now going for the national legal frameworks, we have in Brazil, these are the two main legislation on education in Brazil, the Federal Constitution from 1988 and the National Law of Education from 1996. And they set the basis of what we call the indigenous schooling education and the peasant education, or the education of the rural populations in rural settings, because they recognize the rights of these communities for specific education. So this was important to build what is now the indigenous schooling education, or the peasant school education. And I would just like to stress that it was very important in Brazil, what we call the indigenous schooling education and the peasant education. I call it, just a parenthesis here, I call it peasant education because in Brazil, they difference the rural education from what we call educação do campo. And I translated this educação do campo into peasant education, to difference from the practices that were before. And it was a bottom-up policy. It started with teachers working in peasant settlements or working in the indigenous schools, and they organized themselves in national conferences. So people came from all over Brazil to discuss this and to exchange experiences also, and to have a set of directives and reivindications of what they wanted. So it started in 1997 with the ENERA, and in 2009 also, in the years 2000 also with the indigenous movement. So we have here a set of resolutions from the National Education Council, and that builds the legal framework of what today is the peasant education or the indigenous schooling education. Yeah, so they are resolutions that for the functioning of schools, for the curriculum also of these schools. So it recognizes the right for a specific curriculum, for a bilingual education in the case of the indigenous schools, for an intercultural education in the indigenous schools also, and in the peasant schools, it recognizes the right for them to have a specific calendar, a schooling calendar that will have them, that will adapt to their, to the cycles of life in their region, right? I just would like to stress the third one there, the third resolution that recognizes also the alternance pedagogy. That are some schools that have been implemented in rural areas that they have a concentrated time at school, where usually it's secondary schools where the students learn techniques to work in the land and to enhance their production. And then a time when they go to their properties, to their families, to their communities, and they will apply this, what they've learned at school in their community, and they will have, so this is what we call the alternance pedagogy, and there's a lot of studies of that, especially I would say those of Professor José Pietrafesa, who is a professor at the Universidade Federal de Goiás. He has some work there about this if you are interested. About the governance and finance. So Brazil is a federation and there are shared responsibilities. The federal government is the national policies, and they're also responsible for the higher education. States are responsible for upper secondary education, municipalities for pre-primary and primary education, and the lower secondary education is a responsibility, shared responsibility between states and municipalities. The administration of rural schools, it depends if it is a state school or a municipal school. Since most of the rural schools are of primary level, most of the rural schools are run by the municipalities, right? And for the indigenous schools, there is, it was a reivindication of the movement, and there is a law of the ethno-educational territories that they are established as laws, but they are not yet functioning because the indigenous lands, they are not restricted to the borders of municipalities or states. So this causes a conflict in who runs and who finances these schools. So what they want is that they have an ethno-educational territory where they can run their schools and the financing also. And it's not restricted to these municipal or state borders. About the funding, I will go, I'll try to speed up a little bit so I can have time to talk about everything. And but we have the main funding for basic education in Brazil is a funding system, fund system that's called Fundeb. It expires now in 2020 and in the end of the year, and it was approved, it has been approved. And now we're in progress. They're fighting for the laws to implement it next year. But what it takes into account, it transfers parts of the money for education to the municipalities and to the states according to the number of students who are enrolled in these schools. And it takes into account rurality and indigenous, if the student is in an indigenous school or not. It goes from 15 to 30% higher, funding. Okay, time's finished. Right. And so just to say that it takes into account if the student is in rural and in peasant schools, but it doesn't take into account remoteness, and there's also a problem in the transparency of this money. So the money goes to the municipality or it goes to the state, and it's very difficult to trace the money and to know how much actually goes to each school and to see how it was this money was spent. So now here, just to finish up, another thing from the perspective of the teachers working in rural and remote schools in the Amazon region. So for the report, for the background paper, I interviewed, it's 5 teachers and one indigenous school assistant. And they told me about the difficulties and the problems and also about what's working in their schools. So they're all from the Amazon state, and 5 of them are indigenous. Yeah, we have Denise and Itanager, who are from the Munduruku people, and Arthur, Edson, and Jessin, who are from the Baniwa people. And Emerson, he is from a rural area in the Amazonas, right? So here are just some highlights of what they stressed, and in the paper you can read it better. And it's just so the cost and logistic problems of reaching all communities. Yeah, so funding does not consider remoteness of manufacturing and distributing the educational funds. So a rural school in the rural inscription in the outskirts of Manaus will receive the same money as a rural inscription 100 kilometers from an urban center. So they say we should take into, and Jessing stressed this. Jessing Luciano, he's a professor at the Universidade Federal de Amazonas, but he was also coordinator of the indigenous schooling education in the Ministry of Education of Brazil. And he stressed this, that we have a very good legal framework and we have good directives, but we still have to find ways to implement this and to make it so that everyone follows it. Other problems, schools and infrastructure maintenance problems. They said the teachers they told us about these problems, but they also stressed an important achievement is that that is a result of the teaching upper education programs to teach to have specific teaching programs for indigenous schooling and for peasant schools. Yes, but one problem is that there lacks teachers who are in the public function career. So what happens is that these teachers, they are temporary teachers, so they don't have all of the guarantees of a public function, and they demand more places in the public function career for indigenous schooling teachers and for peasant teachers. Another big challenge is also, so is to offer upper secondary level in the remote communities. They go up to a certain level and then they have to leave if they want to continue their schooling. Lack of learning materials also was stressed by the indigenous teachers. So they say there is a lot of research and about the indigenous languages now, but there is not funding to turn this knowledge into textbooks, into learning materials, and to print them and to distribute them to all the students. And finally, it's the lack of education support. So if these students, if these schools, they are hundreds of kilometers from the urban center, these teachers, they feel a little left out. So they have no teacher meetings where they can discuss what they're doing and what went wrong and what worked with their students. And they say they have no one there to follow up and help them with this. So there is an initiative of FOIN, that's the Federação das Organizações Indígenas do Rio Negro, FOIN. And what they do is that in the beginning of the semester and in the end of the semester, they unite the teachers in a region to discuss the school planning and then how it happened. So this is an idea of how it may work in these rural schools in the state of Amazonas. And thank you. I'm sorry, I passed a little bit of time.
Muchas gracias, Carolina.
Thank you, Carolina. We will now go to the last panel member. His name is Oscar Sanchez, and he's the regional expert on education and geographical location. Oscar is a teacher in finance and international relations with a master in power, participation, and social change from the University of Sussex and Social Policies. He was Secretary of Education of the city of Bogota and often in charge of the municipality. He organized student movement assembly in Colombia. He coordinated the area of democratic governance in the UNDP, and he's director of the National Education Program for Peace in La Paz, in peace in Colombia. And he is specialized in rural education for peace. Oscar, you have 15 minutes for your presentation. Sir, you have the floor. Gracias, Henry. Thank you, Henry. Are you seeing my presentation? Yes, sir. In the team, we have prepared this session where we want to talk about inclusion of territory to see if it's a geographical difference or the notion of territory, how populations and cultures live themselves. There are a number of regional data that match what we have heard before. I will, but it is that inequality is big in rural, but especially when you are away from small towns. And if besides there are more than indigenous population and there are Afro descendants that live in certain, and the armed conflict only has increased inequalities. So it's a superposition of a number of situations. There is the poverty of the rural population is 3 times that of the urban poverty. The possibilities of actually below 5 or kindergarten is very limited. Literacy, rurality is 3 times that of the country, and it has been in up to 70% in the dispersed area. So it's 4 times that of the country. Now, in spite of that, I'll show you some charts, the atypical ways. That is, within one region, certain schools and communities are doing very well, or comparing regions in spite of these national averages, some regions are much better. This case shows that it is linked to public policies and the empowerment of communities and not geographical location. And that is the starting point of our thinking process. That is the notion of territory on the one hand, and those who acknowledge the diversity of the territories and offer compensation policies, measures. And if with these two in mind, we can overcome the bad results of certain areas. I will first talk about exclude, but I will show exclusion areas. There are examples of work with communities that can be useful for our recommendations. This shows the equality in poverty. See, in primary education, that's the second group of bars, there are differences, but they're not so big. But as we move ahead in the educational in high school, the difference is much bigger between urban and rural, especially with a scattered one. And when we go to senior high school in Colombia, we have coverage of 26% only, whereas for in the primary we have 77% in primary. In other words, we have 2/3 of the students between primary schools and senior high school leave. And then we have the privilege that managed to the forced part usage. Those are the few who left would have positive results. But if you take a look at this chart, it shows the results in the standard test at the end of high school, A is very satisfactory, but C and D is very bad. And inequalities are also there for the small group. They're huge in terms of performance in math. And this is the graph chart. The upper part is math, the lower part is reading. The very bad results in scattered is much worse than those who are urban in math and reading. And if we see it in terms of years, schooling years, although there has been an improvement, there is a standard result which is twice. So people, one of them goes twice as many years to school as the others. So, confirming these data, there are differences inside the countries, but also between countries. You can check the differences are big. For example, in Uruguay, that has the same opportunities as Colombia, 10.4 for in 2018. In the rural, Colombia is 6, Uruguay is 9. And if we took in consideration the scatter, it would be first. So I went to see rural schools in Germany. The performance levels in Germany are the same for urban and rural. In some rural areas, they're even better. Now, this is complementary. This is what we call intersectionality. This is very dramatic in Colombia. Whereas 20% of the population lives in rural areas, out of the victims of the armed conflict in Colombia, 63% comes from the rural areas. Also, there is a higher proportion of youngsters of the ethnic groups in the rural. But if we see gender perspective, Colombia is the country with the worst distribution of land ownership. And Latin America in general is very bad. Only 20% of women have a deed on their land. The other 80% goes to men. And something that is very important to take into account is that the teachers in the rural areas are female. 2 out of 3 are women in rural areas. So what one says, it may be the geographical distance and the type of policies and approaches could be used for these excluded populations to have, as Carolina would say, the same rights by taking into account the realities they face, and how to build such a specific policy from those realities onwards. We take these human beings with their specific particularities, and that's why we wonder about the territory. This is not a physical space, but a cultural, environmental, economic space shared by communities who either construct, build, or nobody will. So there are 5 little things that I would like to point out as exclusion factors and give you some hints about where to go. The first one is the interculturality. We say that we need the value of the various communities living on a territory be acknowledged. We have the indigenous populations, and we have to acknowledge the value of each. And as the Convention 169 of the ILO says, to acknowledge the same values for the national communities, taking into account history, etc., etc. They must be valued for everybody. That is of the essence to achieve something that we have talked here about, rooting, cosmopolitan roots. The question is how you can offer somebody living in an indigenous village the possibility of acknowledging the value of his or her roots and also everything that's inside the country and the rest of the world, and to freely choose their identity, knowingly that that's the way to value their own policies. That is the idea behind intercultural life, which means giving a voice to the communities, to strengthen the organization of the ethnical groups, but not only for their local environment or even for the country for that matter, but for the whole world, and to make a lot of research to really get to know how these people mingle, how they get to know how they live together, how they educate each other, what the pedagogy of these, and that all of this be acknowledged by the rest of the nation. A second topic linked to the previous one is the question which curriculum allows to see this. And here the recommendations are there to see how to educate and how to evaluate the context and to understand that this dilemma, and I think it was mentioned by the previous speaker, between a positive discrimination outlook should not be criticized their right to quality, the quality of language, of abstract thinking, of scientific thinking, but to make sure that there is a balance. And balance means diversity and means autonomy. That's why, just to give you one example, in Colombia, we have not managed for resources to be used so that the assessments of the quality in education be carried out in the language of the original peoples and many things like that. Another fundamental dimension is with what vision of development do work on the programs of curricula, because this entails understanding the baselines of their own cultures, their own. We have the forests, the mountains, and the seas are sources of raw materials. We have to build these resources, these curricula that says that the richest of the country is the cultural diversity, but that also for humanity, the heritage of a rural world is absolutely of the essence, because the model we have is not sustainable. But if we do not take that into account and we don't build that as we should, and the solution for the global sustainability dilemma, we cannot answer to humanity. So from rurality, we can build programs that really make development.
So that has to be done recognizing the natural conflicts on territories. And here there are some inspiring experiences. For instance, the Colombian school, Tolima, worked with the coffee institution to recognize biodiversity and ecosystems. Now, the third topic is isolated teachers. It's been mentioned before by other speakers. The recommendation of policy is that teachers be understood as the intellectuals of their communities. They belong to that community because ideally they belong to the same region, they came from those schools, or because they have settled down there and they are allowed to do so. There are many, many, many examples of how when a teacher is left in a territory, one day he is replaced overnight. That teachers have specialized training that will allow them to develop skills to understand that context in which they are working. To recognize that rural areas are complex and multi-year or grade schools can have good results with the right pedagogical approaches to strengthen the teaching and the training of teachers for rural schools to strengthen the network of teachers so that they have networks, microcenters, and support other teachers. There are many programs of this sort in Latin America. And avoid the loneliness of the teachers, facilitate their quality of life, policies of lodging, transportation, connectivity for teachers in the rural areas with a gender perspective, of course, taking into account the situation of women. And also it's important to build learning communities so that teachers become involved in the development of education policies in their territories. Now, the fourth subject has to do with institutionality. Institutionality. You cannot think only in terms of education. We had to think about this comprehensively. We had to dedicate resources. If there is necessity to have specialized teachers, you need more money. In Colombia, there are examples that with another 70, 80% of resources, you get the same results. But the general fiscal impact is not that big, and the benefit is huge, not only because it is fair from my point of view of the rights of communities and territories to quality education, but because in the medium and long term, the return on investment is very efficient, and the cost, in the case of Colombia, is simple. 70–80% of students that drop out between the ages of 10 and 18, many ones have early pregnancies or to the poorer sectors, but many others become warriors. So the cost of that is out of proportion. So we had to economically and efficiently invest more in those territories. Now, in times of pandemic and post-pandemic times, how to strengthen virtual education, remote education as a powerful model. And pedagogy should be the one that prevails and demanding technology. One problem is access to internet, to devices, and even to power. Limiting the access to ICTs is low. The background problem is that ICTs don't have pedagogical background without strengthening scientific know-how or the use of technology. So the response to that is to help first to make communities how to do research of their context, transformation of reality, artistic creation, etc. And based on that, or after that, demand the ICTs. It's not the technological industry sending content. The pedagogical capacity of demanding technological tools should be the norm. And people will learn how to use them because they are available. The tools and the content, the objects of learning. And it should be the right scientific know-how, the one that approaches technology. And there are possibilities of critical maintenance as the genetic modification, etc. Things that concern territories or different districts. This is everything I had to share with you. Together with the IIP, we are setting up a network on education, rural education, by reading the GEM report. The approach of inclusive education to tear down the barriers of populations is very pertinent to address discrimination because there is a a viewer's perspective that is different from the territory or not territorially focused. So thank you very much.
Nuestros cuatro panelistas han planteado toda una serie
I think our four panelists have
realmente nos permiten pensar
described
en
many topics that allow us to think about schools not only as challenges but also as opportunities. And the big challenge is that, according to the figures that we saw earlier, based on what Adriana said, the elements of intergenerational transmission of poverty, as Christian mentioned, and these last two presentations, Carolina and Oscar also mentioned to us, this school appears as a mechanism of reproduction of inequalities. And so the question is, what type of school do we want to build? Both those schools that are working with the lowest quintiles of poverty, and those schools, in the case of Brazil, or rural schools, or escolas do campo in Brazil. So on top of improving education, access to education, have the challenge of thinking in issues such as construction of the citizenry, leadership, building skills for the 21st century in order to put all these inequalities that were pre-existing to bring them to the surface. So we have several questions on the channel. And what Oscar mentioned at the end of his presentation is very pertinent. From IIP UNESCO, we have developed a project to help different organizations initiative to set up a Latin American network of rural secondary education. In the chat box, you will see a contact email address for those institutions, ministries, educational institutions, or regional, sub-regional institutions that would like to get more information. So, Mercedes, please share with us some questions. So you, first of all, let me remind you of our Twitter account, and you can retweet by using the hashtag forum IPE 2020. Now, from El Salvador, questions had to do with the role of the teacher. Edgar Abrego from the Ministry of Education of El Salvador. Please speak into the mic, Edgar. Good morning, everybody. My greetings from Central America. Since yesterday, we have got into waters that will lead us to a different future. So given the background presented to us by panelists, what are the future prospects for our boys and girls that are educated in a rural school? In the case of El Salvador, teachers that teach in those centers are relatively abandoned. The rural teaching activity has the face of women, and they teach multi-years, multi-grades. So what is the future of these girls and boys? So, and what's the role of the teachers against that background? Thank you, Edgar. We give the floor to panelists. Let me tell you that in my presentation, I touch upon those aspects that could make those perspectives positive perspectives. If there is that opportunity of endogenous development of rural territories, especially with ethnic populations recognizing their environmental richness, that could be positive. So I can share some good practices experiences of how some communities have made this possible.
Just answering the question also, I agree with Oscar. And here in Brazil, there are many actually initiatives, especially of those that I said of the EFAs, family agricultural schools, and also indigenous schools. There is an indigenous school that was a big reference called Pamali School. So in these schools, they have a big dialogue with the community and with the families, and they also teach the students how to work the land and how to produce in a sustainable way, and so also to keep the students to show to the youngsters, to the youth, that they can stay in their land and they can produce there, and that especially tied to family agriculture, and that family agriculture is an important production also.
Bueno, a mí me gustaría comentar algo porque yo de hecho
I
soy
would like to add something. I'm from Salvador. Greetings from Central America too. And this year I did some research into education in Salvador. And we would have to see first how to train teachers in order to teach in multi-grade systems. And this is a reality in El Salvador, and teachers perhaps are not trained to teach children at different ages. And in some segments, the education population is overage. And teachers should not only have good teaching skills, but also have supportive skills to support students of different ages and different psychological backgrounds. So it's important that teachers support them at all ages and levels. And schools should be endowed with the resources and differential psychological and pedagogical material. In Salvador, there are differences in terms of access to ICTs, laboratories, libraries. There is an issue with territorial inequalities, but also has to do with social economic factors. And Oscar mentioned ICTs to be able to access different schools, but this also has to do with the purchasing power of the population. Both in Salvador, Dominican Republic, there is a major difference in terms of access and frequency of the population in first quintiles and the higher quintiles in terms of access to computers, connectivity, technology, and the skills developed to be able to do this. This also affects not only children of school age, but also adults that have to support those students. And in the adult population, the levels of familiarity with the use of ICTs for education purposes is very low. There are adults that don't use internet, so how can they support their children? Their children also have their barriers to live in this environment that was made mandatorily virtual this year. So we had to build these territorial spaces in schools and not see them as isolated units, but as territorial spaces with specialized resources and be able to work together. So we need focused policies based on needs, not on resources. so that everybody can resolve their problems. Therefore, we should build on universality, not based on a principle of equality, but rather equity, to give differently to everyone. So at the end, the outcome is the same for everyone.
Bien, estamos ya sobre la hora, pero tenemos espacio
One
para
more question from La Red. The network of specialists in education policy in Latin America. A very specific question to close for Adriana and Christian. Elmira Huerta from Chile. Migration is being a growing phenomenon that has enriched culturally different places, but there are huge gaps of economic inequality. These populations settle in locations of high economic vulnerability. So how can we guarantee equality for these students in contexts of high vulnerability?
Mercedes, voy a comentar rápidamente y aprovecho a comentar un par de preguntas más que estaban en el chat hacia mí. Es un buen ejemplo, muchas gracias por la...
It's a good example. Thank you very much for the question. In Chile, the school system is highly segregated, socioeconomically and ethnically very segregated, and that's a barrier. And that's a barrier for migrant students too. So what we see is that they access a school system that processes them, that is organized as a competitive market, very little regulation, processes the rest of the population that is according to their economic resources and their education performance. So students, children of migrants in Chile are being referred to schools where they also meet with children from other migrant families. So one of the questions asked about public institutionality, my critical comment has to do above all with the need of building public systems to guarantee universal rights. This in Chile has been really weakened because privatization has operated with this rationale of deregulated market. So we had to discuss on a case-by-case basis the role of private education in the provision of a social universal right, such as right to education. So the role of students and the students' movement. This is an excellent, has been claiming for justice, for more quality, for non-market driven education for 15 years. And now that is a social movement that has resulted into the decision to change the constitution. So why is it that students had to make it to that extreme? Because there is no space for spaces that take into account the opinion of students that treat them as clients. In our study in Chile, we have seen that in turbulent times, there should be a huge crisis before changing, and some changes are positive. So we need to have school systems that don't need crises in order to change and innovate permanently. So students, children of migrant families, when they access a school system that is not equitable, that doesn't have public service guaranteeing universal rights to education, are affected in the same way as lower classes. So policies have to be multidimensional, cyclical, and institutional.
Basil Bernstein, antes de probar la educación compensatoria y los
Before patching up, let us try providing quality education to all. And then let's go to the patching up policies when we see that some spaces to be mended. But we haven't tested the basics, access to quality education system for low and underprivileged classes. I'm a specialist in migration as well. I can say two things. First, we had to understand the heterogeneity of migration and on the migrant education population. And one of the most important barriers for migrants is language, especially if they come from an indigenous population. They come into a country that don't have the same language, country that in where the same language is not spoken. So this also entails a huge issue. But there are others more associated to the changes of an education system from one country to another, and there is an administrative process that also implies resources for countries and for families. So, in connection with migration, there will be a more specialized subtopic on that. And along these lines, we have to consider how inequalities add up. Migration in the curricula has its peculiarities that are not compatible with the socioeconomic part, but they also consider language, the capability of even, seeing how this works, certify that, what are the costs needed and what are the costs that could be deferred, school segregation, and how they get together with other excluded groups. And regarding privatization, I would like to refocus what I said in my presentation. The focus is not looking to the management itself. Is public or private is better? I consider that education is a right, so it has to be guaranteed by the state as such. There are different ways to do it now. The problem is that in the division that we have now, that private schools perform better, what we are doing is stratifying that right to education. We have floors where we have one at a time, and we reproduce inequality. So the focus is we shouldn't look into management only, but emphasize what students bring to school, that backpack of socioeconomic situations that are differentiated. And in the case of Dominican Republic, most of the students of the public sector have lower income than in case of private students, private school students. So those that are in socio-economic classes that have more resources, have more opportunities to go to private schools. So we need to address that issue that makes low-income population be more exposed to abandonment, dropouts, and other shortcomings. So we should understand the diversity of the core of our students and their problems, but not only in the classroom, but also the bigger, wider background. We had to displace that focus from the management, whether it is private or public, but emphasize this differential population that we have. And work on universal policies that respond more to equity parameters and equality in the input provided to schools, because what we have is universal education policies input to give everybody equally on an equal footing, but we don't know if that input is the most appropriate, most suitable vis-a-vis the demand of different sectors. And in this socioeconomic background, not only rural sectors are important, but in this accelerated urbanization process in Latin America, there are other segments of stratified urban centers, and we have to look into the urban precarious centers. These are these areas of underprivileged sectors in the cities, which are not only spaces of inclusion, but also of exclusion. So we need to look into it, and we had to treat that in a differential manner.
Thank you very much, Christian and Adriana. And I think we will now finalize the Q&A section. And Henry, you have the last word for a very small greeting. Thank you, Mercedes. I just wanted to repeat our thanks to Adriana, Christian, Carolina, and Oscar for these very important presentations. I think we've seen a number of topics, both in the presentations and the Q&A section. I think the role of each of these has become important of the territories, not only for these spaces of participation, but those that have been conquered by civil society, demanding greater access and quality to education, and the education thought as an entrance door to other rights. It's a very interesting debate for universal policies, the teaching issue, the issue of teaching career design, the territorial advancement that has been also been very well envisaged, all of the territorial development linked to a vision of education rooted in the local policies. That was very interesting as well. I think that with all of these inputs, we have food for thought for many workshops that we will have tomorrow and the day after. Thank you very much. Thank you to the PAM and everybody for the link of the survey is already available on the chat. I would be thankful if you could take a few minutes to answer. Before we move to the pause, I want you all to turn your cameras on, and those who already have it to please smile to the camera so we can take a group picture of this panel. You can comb if you need. We take 2, 1, cheese. Thank you. I'm told that everybody is fine. So with these small image, this is the end of panel number 3. We will move to a 15-minute pause, but I ask all of you to remain in this very room to take again with the next activity panel number 4 with education, mobility, and ethnics. Thank you very much.